This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. Before the pandemic struck 2 years ago, campus safety was a front-burner issue for many school districts. Now, with buildings reopened and some educators reporting a rise in bad behavior, the conversation is once again shifting to how to best keep children safe and what role, if any, school police should have on campus. Joining us to talk about this is Corey Mitchell. He writes about racial, gender, and economic inequality in education for the Center for Public Integrity, a nonprofit news organization. He's also an old friend of the podcast. Corey, welcome back to EWA Radio.
Thank you for having me, Emily. Just really a joy to be back.
Let's start with some definitions and terminology, just so everybody's on the same page when we talk about school police. What is a school resource officer?
I think in most cases, a school resource officer is a sworn law enforcement officer who is armed, and that person is on campus because the school district has a partnership with a local law enforcement agency that allows them to be either in the school or on campus. But things can get confusing when you talk about the different types of security and law enforcement presence that you have on campus. School resource officers, security guards, school officers are all different. But sometimes a single school or school district can have all three of these people. So the basic answer is easy, but when you think about all the combinations that can happen, that schools try to make sure that their buildings and students are safe, there's a lot of people on campus.
Well, certainly, school resource officer sounds a lot kinder and gentler than armed guard or campus police. And maybe it sounds like a little bit more approachable, but it's worth mentioning that they do have a national organization and they don't want people calling people school resource officers if they haven't gone through prescribed training, including how to work with young people. Is that right?
That's exactly right. There is an organization that provides training for school resource officers, sort of defines who these people are. They have members all across the nation in many states and many school districts, and they work to try to convince people that there is a place for law enforcement presence on campus. These people should be responsible. They should be a good fit for a school environment, and they should be well trained.
What does the research tell us happens when you have school police, and we're talking about someone who's gone through a sworn peace officer academy, has had this training, is on campus, and is armed? What happens when these school police officers are part of a campus community?
Well, there's not really an easy answer here. There's a working paper from the Annenberg Institute at Brown University that says that the school resource officers can reduce some forms of violence on school campuses. Presence leads to a decrease in the number of fights and physical assaults. But with those benefits come trade-offs. They've been linked to increased absenteeism, more suspensions, expulsions, and more law enforcement referrals and arrest of students. So you do cut back on these incidents, but you do sort of have fallout as a result.
In 2020, George Floyd was killed by Minneapolis police. That set off protests not only in that city, but a national reaction. And local school districts in Minneapolis pledged to rethink the role of campus police in their public schools. Similar conversations were already happening in a lot of districts at that time, but you have found through your reporting that some of the early pledges to pull back school police officers or even defund them are not being carried out the way people might have thought they would have been. Tell us a little bit more about what things look like right now in Minneapolis.
Well, Minneapolis is one of many places that, when you talk about reducing police presence in schools, it's not that much different than rethinking the role of law enforcement outside of school. It's a fraught debate. In some cases, a single incident on or near a campus or a rash of fights or, a really bad assault can quickly shift public opinion. They've sort of been able to make a transition in Minneapolis, but as some local reporting and some reporting from some other news organizations have revealed, they brought in, while getting rid of a contract with the Minneapolis Police Department, they brought in folks with very much, the majority of these folks had law enforcement backgrounds. And you question, okay, are you really making a transition to something different, or are you just sort of, we're going to put law enforcement back on campus, we're just not going to call them school resource officers? And it's not the only place. Denver ended contracts with police and pulled school resource officers off campus, but they replaced those school resource officers with armed and uniformed security staff who have the authority to issue citations and tickets to students. Milwaukee canceled its contracts with the city police department, but the people inside schools are still calling them like hundreds of times per month to respond to incidents inside of schools. So it's really a question like you're removing these folks, but how much change is really happening?
I want to talk about some more definitions because we're going to get into some very important original analysis that was done by you and your team at CPI related to school law enforcement and what happens when they are on campus. So, what does it mean when we say that a student has been referred to law enforcement? How is that different from them being suspended or even expelled?
When a student is referred to law enforcement, it simply means that a school employee has reported that student to a law enforcement agency or officer. And one thing that we had to really work to try to make clear to our readers is that all arrests are referrals, but not all referrals lead to arrest. So a referral could be something that leads to a student being ticketed or have to appear in court. It doesn't always lead to an arrest, even though there's roughly, there's hundreds of thousands of students each year that are referred to law enforcement. So, I mean, it just kind of captures, I would say over time, the Department of Education has kind of tweaked that definition to include like any contact that a student can have with law enforcement that could have negative consequences for the student.
Corey, you and I have both been on this beat for a while. We remember persistently dangerous schools, that designation under No Child Left Behind. States had a lot of leeway in how they determined whether a school was considered persistently dangerous. But one of the things that happened was you found principals were holding back on reporting some of these numbers or making these referrals because they didn't want a school to be labeled. And I'm curious right now, is there still a lot of variation among districts and states in what kind of student behaviors trigger a referral to law enforcement?
Definitely, definitely. I mean, we see some of the states that on average have the largest share or percentage of referrals. There are often state laws that require mandatory reporting of what we may consider like minor infractions. There's also the fact that there's a lot of leeway. It's a very subjective thing. As you go across the country, there's no mandatory reporting in some states. So you get some states that rarely ever report any law enforcement referrals. But one of the places that we focused in on our reporting is Virginia, which has led the nation in law enforcement referrals for quite a long time. There's just a law on the books that was recently reinstated that requires frequent interaction between students and law enforcement for even relatively minor things. And it just raises questions about what do you really need a law enforcement officer for on a campus. We typically tend to associate them with school shootings when those things happen, but they may be getting called in for disputes between teachers and students or for vandalism and things like that. And you really wonder, I mean, is there someone already on campus who can handle these things?
I'm wondering, as a national reporter, having these variations in protocols and in even definitions, does that make it very difficult to compare among states?
It makes it extremely difficult. We think about the Virginias, the Wisconsins, states that our numbers show have clear issues with the number of law enforcement referrals and disparities by race and disability status. But some of the states at the bottom of that list, your Michigan, the District of Columbia. There are districts and schools in that state and in the district that I'm sure have issues with disparities in law enforcement referral, and not making a judgment call here, but perhaps over referral overall. So just because the numbers are better in some places doesn't mean that everything is okay there. I would guess that there's thousands of stories that they need a reporter to take a look at to say, okay, what are we doing here? Are we doing things, are doing right by these students? Are we wasting the resources of a law enforcement agency on minor things? So it's a lot of variation there.
I want to share some of the top line from your investigation in September 2021 with your CPI colleagues Susan Ferris and Joe Girardi. You analyzed U.S. Department of Education data for all 50 states plus the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico, and you found that school policing disproportionately affected students with disabilities, Black children, and in some states, Native American and Latina children. And nationally, Black students and children with disabilities were referred to law enforcement at nearly twice their share of the overall population. That new analysis certainly lines up with previous data that's been looked at from earlier years. Who's really paying attention to this outside of education journalism? Do you feel like there's a groundswell right now, maybe building off some of the national protests that we've seen about equity in education, that change is coming?
I think we did in the immediate aftermath of George Floyd's death. But as you mentioned before in introducing this segment, that as students would begin to return to class and there were fears about student safety, public opinion has kind of swung in the opposite direction in many of these places that took a step back and say, well, we're not going to partner with a local law enforcement agency anymore. All it takes is one incident to sway that public opinion. I think most people, even outside of education journalism, are familiar with the concept of the school to prison pipeline. And this is part of the funnel. There are definitely issues, racial bias, people not fully understanding the needs of students with disabilities that lead to unfair treatment for certain students. I think it should be more a part of the national discussion. But there are some hot button issues that have kind of emerged in the nearly 2 years since that have pushed that to the back burner.
You talked about that it only can take one big fight for public opinion to change, but you've also shared some really egregious examples of children being referred to police or even mishandled physically by police officers, young, vulnerable kids who aren't even in their double digits yet in terms of age. I'm guessing some of those stories and videos are having an impact as well.
We tend to think about school resource officers in two ways. We tend to think, okay, this is the person that should be there to respond to an active shooter. And we also see some of these videos where students are slammed to the ground or assaulted or tossed over a desk. There's a lot of gray area in between that can cause harm to students. A 6, 7, 8 year old face to face with a police officer who's threatening you or speaking menacingly. I can't imagine that sort of trauma is something that just sort of goes away the next day. But I think, our reporting and reporting from a number of other news organizations have shown that there's often this interaction between law enforcement officers and very young children, or even talking like middle school age children without parental consent and really don't know what's happening. You sort of trust school administration to sort of be there to sort of guide discussions and be there to support a student while explaining, this is why we think law enforcement needed to be called in. But what we found in many cases is that once law enforcement arrives on a campus, that school administration, they often defer to these people. It's out of a respect for law enforcement. Whether that's healthy or not is up for debate. But when you turn a student over to law enforcement, they don't have the same set of tools and skills they've been taught as educators. They basically have one tool in their tool belt when it comes to a kid they're having a problem with. Is either, well, two, there's either arrest or the threat of an arrest, or I guess in some cases, a citation. And that's not really a recipe for success in dealing with young people. I don't think a lot of young people deal well when we talk about absolutes, my way or the highway. You just want to work with them on their level, and the threat of arrest on arrest is not going to get the law enforcement officer anywhere, and it's going to get the kid in trouble when maybe they really didn't need to be in trouble. They just needed someone to talk to.
One of the points of analysis that you did in this project was to look at referral rates by states for Black students. Virginia topped the list with nearly 26 Black students referred for every 1,000 enrolled. We're going to get back to Virginia in just a moment. Down near the bottom, by comparison, was the District of Columbia, Michigan, Massachusetts. They each had 2.1%. And Puerto Rico barely registered on the chart with less than 0.5%. As you started to unpack these numbers, what was surprising to you?
When you look at the top there, Virginia, you see Pennsylvania, Wisconsin near the top, but you also see states like New Hampshire and South Dakota, states that don't have a significant Black population. I think the clear answer there has to be racial bias. Across the nation, Black students are referred to law enforcement nearly twice their share of the overall student population. I don't think it's a matter of behavior in many of these cases. It's a matter of perception. You may have many students, doing sort of the same things in class, maybe disrupting class. Maybe there was a shoving incident of some sort, but maybe this Black student, is a bit taller. Maybe the teacher perceives them as more of a threat. Whatever it is happening is leading these students to situations where they're forced to interact with law enforcement. Maybe they're 8 or maybe they're 18. But either way, I don't think most people would say it's the desired outcome for any child. So we really have to start thinking about racial bias. Not only we tend to focus a lot on sort of the motivations and the bias we tie to law enforcement officers, but we also have to think about the educators in the buildings who are making these calls or summoning in a school resource officer. Like, what sort of biases or motivations do they have in these interactions? Because they play a role as well.
You wrote specifically about Virginia and the pendulum on school policing policies making a shift to the left recently, but it seems like it was a temporary shift and now it's swinging back toward the right. In part, they have a new governor, a new Republican governor, Glenn Youngkin. What is he doing differently?
Governor Youngkin seized on public concern about some sex assault cases in the Northern Virginia area, and he's with that he pressured districts to have a school resource officer in every school. He pushed to repeal a law and signed that law recently that requires schools to report certain incidents to law enforcement, like fights and minor drug offenses. And he's just he's stoked public debate over lots of issues in education, but issues around school security and school resource officers has definitely been high on his list. He sort of, in his first 100 days, he wanted to get some of these issues on school policing and school security addressed, and he has thus far. And it's just a playbook that he developed that could possibly be deployed in other states as well.
We're talking with Corey Mitchell of the Center for Public Integrity about covering school police and campus safety. If you're enjoying EWA Radio, tell your friends. You can also subscribe and get new episodes a day before everyone else. Look for us on your favorite podcasting app. Corey, I'm curious, what are some of the limitations to the data you got from the U.S. Department of Education on those law enforcement referrals?
The biggest limitation is that we are certain in some places that there was significant underreporting, but it's hard to quantify what you don't know. But we would find differences between the number of law enforcement referrals and state data sets versus the federal civil rights data collection. And we would call districts up and say, well, can you explain you reported, let's say, 125 law enforcement referrals this school year to your state Department of Education and zero to the federal government? What happened here? And it's like, oh, well, we don't know. Or, the person who did it was not paying attention that day. They made a sloppy mistake. But it just sort of seemed to be the mistake that would happen with law enforcement referrals because, if you do have significant disparities, it's the sort of thing that can draw federal scrutiny, which I don't think that anybody really wants, especially right now. But when you fail to underreport or fail to report these interactions between police and students, we don't know how often children are being questioned by law enforcement or in some cases being arrested by law enforcement. And it stymies efforts to ensure that the civil rights of all children are being protected. Because if we do have evidence that certain students are being targeted for these law enforcement referrals, I think that the Education Department, the Department of Civil Rights, would like to be aware of this. And without the accurate data, no one really knows.
Corey, as part of this investigation and project, you partnered with many local news organizations across the country, and there were some bright lines here, weren't there?
Definitely. We found some places where conversations or simply changes in policies at the local school district level led to reductions in the number of law enforcement referrals. Sometimes it was a school district going to a law enforcement agency or a law enforcement agency going to a school district to come to an agreement that these are the circumstances under which you can call us in to address a student. We don't need to handle classroom matters. So when reporters look at this data or they pursue stories, not everything is going to be about a school district or a law enforcement agency not doing what's right. In many cases, it will be, but in some cases, you will find people doing things to sort of rethink their approach to policing student or trying to stop the over policing of certain types of students. So I think those types of stories are important to consider as well.
That seems to me like a great place for local reporters to really carve out important space for themselves because they're getting at the information that may not be reflected in state or certainly federal numbers.
Definitely. The numbers are just a start. You may find disparities, you may not, but I think that while there is, at many points, especially in the aftermath of an incident, there is a focus on school security and safety. But anything reporters can do, either before or after such an incident, to let readers know, to let parents know, to let students know, like, what does law enforcement presence look like? What does security look like? I think everyone benefits from that. I think that there's a level of comfort and understanding, but there's also people being armed with information to question whether or not this is appropriate, for the community is also a conversation to be had that local journalists, state journalists, and even national journalists can sort of, bring to the forefront.
Are there organizations or databases you would recommend education reporters familiarize themselves with when they're trying to parse some of these numbers? Who are some folks they should talk to?
The folks at the ACLU have made this quite a focus. They've done lots of national reports. They've even, like states such as Florida, Pennsylvania, Utah, they've done some deep dives at the state level to look at not only law enforcement referrals, but also like student arrest and the outcomes of actually arresting a child for something that happened on campus and the sort of disparities that emerge when you begin looking at the data. I think any civil rights organization, any local civil rights organization, for any reporters looking to tackle a story on this, any disability rights organizations, because we think about the racial disparities, those seem to be something that we understand happens among any interaction that people have with law enforcement. But students with disabilities are, in many cases, bearing the brunt of this as well. It could be students with autism, or it could be students with physical disabilities being roughed up by school resource officers. So I think that there's lots of organizations that have questions about what's happening in local school districts. And I'm sure that whether you're a local, regional, state, or national reporter, there are people out there who are really focused on this issue and want some answers and have questions about the data in their backyard or in their state or in their part of the country. So I don't think there's any shortage of people willing to talk about this.
What has been the response to your reporting on this topic, specifically looking at those state by state numbers? Have there been changes that have been made?
Well, there haven't been any firm changes. Progress is kind of slow. And I think, as most education journalists know, sometimes like data and solid reporting move the needle much initially. And even sometimes when you think about like state law and school board, local school board policies sometimes fly in the face of this stuff. You can report these things out and, people like, oh, okay, yeah, I mean, that's nice, but we're going to go ahead and do what we think is best. We did partner with a number of news organizations across the country who were able to take a look at their local numbers. And I know that in Georgia, the Cobb County Courier reported on the case of a 13-year-old with autism who was referred to juvenile court on felony charges without his family's knowledge. And their investigation and reporting is led to a state investigation. So we've seen some movement like locally from some of our partners, and there has been like a renewed push for some federal legislation around school policing that came after our initial report. But as far as changes at the state level, not yet. But I think that as we begin to get back to normal with schools and we really begin to rethink why law enforcement is on campus, we're hopeful that more states and even people on Capitol Hill in DC will dive into this issue once again.
I learned from your story that the jump in the number of school resource officers came with the boom in federal funding after the Columbine high school shooting in Littleton, Colorado in 1999. And I have to say, I felt like there was some irony here because this was a case of two active shooters who actually weren't stopped by police and whose prior behavior issues were arguably mishandled to some degree by law enforcement. There was even an armed guard at the high school who exchanged gunfire with at least one of the shooters, but that didn't stop the attack. In other words, the boom in funding for more school police officers was inspired by an example where more police didn't necessarily solve the problem.
And that sort of goes back to that thing about sort of data and information. The decisions that are made often fly in the face of the data and the information that's available. There was another big push post Parkland where there was a school resource officer on campus who, out of fear, declined to respond to confront the shooter. It's in the aftermath of these very, very deadly and very, very sad and heart-wrenching incidents that talk about funding ramps up. But there's not a lot of talk about where that money should be going in the quiet moments in between and whether or not it's an effective use of federal resources. So, I mean, we did take a look at that. There are no easy answers because the public will demand change after a Columbine, after a Parkland, and rightfully so. But I don't know whether that energy should be expended on solely focusing on hardening campuses and bringing more law enforcement on campuses. Perhaps we could direct that energy in another direction to address some other issues.
Well, let's talk about directing in another direction. There's been some important reporting in the past few months about policing out of Los Angeles Unified, which is the nation's second largest school system. The district redirected about $25 million, that's a third of its school policing budget, to programs and services to directly support Black students' mental health and well-being. There are some early results showing that math and reading scores are up in the district and behavior problems have declined. What's your take on that?
It sounds promising, and I'm guessing that most people want to see if those gains can be sustained and also how they're measured. But it does raise questions about whether all student groups are part of that improvement. Like, what students are benefiting most? Where do they live in the city? What's their background? Ideally, in the end, you'd hope that redirecting those funds would lead to a decrease in suspensions and expulsions and law enforcement referrals as proof that things are improving. And I mean, sure, there's certainly, hopefully, some academic benefits as well. I think we all want students to do well. We just have to figure out the right mix of support to make that happen. And it's very much local control issues, but you have to figure out like what role or how much of that formula should include law enforcement presence.
I noticed in several of your stories, you have a Q&A at the end with students from the communities you're covering. Can you tell me about what drove that decision to make youth voices such a consistent and prominent part of how you report on this issue?
Yeah, our main story in September didn't make much room for student voice. It was a very policy focused and incident focused story where we just looked at state numbers, we looked at some districts, and we looked at some particular incidents involving students. And we didn't necessarily want these students to have to relive that trauma if possible. But including the youth voice in pieces allow readers and us the opportunity to hear from young people affected by police presence and by these decisions. This stuff isn't happening in a vacuum. If you are a young person and you're pushing and say, we don't want more police in our schools, and you think you finally get a win, and then 3 or 4 months later, you have armed security guards back in your school, I'm sure it can be deflating, but also kind of scary. I don't know anyone who wants to go to class and experience high school or middle school under the watch of armed guards. That has to be unsettling. You think that you're providing, safety for students, but I mean, their mere presence for many students makes them feel unsafe. So it's just a very like thorny issue, and we definitely wanted to get some youth voice in here because as an adult, I can say this is what's wrong with it. But when you hear directly from a young person, it sits a little bit longer with you than sometimes the data or the research or the quote from an expert will.
I got to tell you, one of the favorite things that I saw on this topic in recent years was Sonali Kohli from the LA Times, where she had students go back in and actually annotate her stories to tell her where they thought she missed the mark or where she got their school community right. And I just thought that was a brilliant idea.
Yeah, I remember that as well. It was just brilliant. And I mean, it's so important to not just write about people, but to write with and for people. As I'm sure that there's a lot of young people who read that as well in the Los Angeles and just California area who thought, okay, there's somebody out there who cares and who's trying to understand because the young people often get lost in these policy debates.
What does responsible coverage of school police and school safety look like right now? What should other education journalists be thinking about?
I think it's like any other issue when you talk about education reporting. There are two things that are very important: context and perspective. If a district or law enforcement agency is reporting an increase or a surge in violence, ask how the current numbers compare to previous years. If a district is ending a relationship with a law enforcement agency, ask what's going to be done in the aftermath. And I know that the Education Week is going in and look at taking a look at some of those districts that decided to end contracts with local law enforcement agency. And the 74 is really taking a few deep look with their coverage, taking a few deep looks at what's happened in Minneapolis, and that coverage has been good as well. And I think this is something that I referenced earlier as well. The headline on our main story is when schools call police on kids. We as reporters, it's easy now to sort of question biases that the law enforcement bring to their work. But it's a little bit more difficult to take a look at what's happening inside of schools or what's happening with educators to think about, okay, why are they calling either frequently or infrequently? Why are they calling law enforcement agencies into school? Does it really merit this attention? It's like, where do you draw the line? I mean, is it a fight? I mean, is it marijuana possession? Just where do you draw the line? Is it necessary? So I just think that that context and perspective is important as we see sort of the numbers and the data as a start to the reporting. It can help inform the reporting and sort of guide places that we should go and ask questions, but it's just the start. Because as we pointed out earlier in this conversation, we don't even know in many places if the numbers are accurate. We get a sense that they are in some places and others aren't, but it's definitely worth investigating as well.
Corey Mitchell writes about racial, gender, and economic inequality in education for the Center for Public Integrity. Before joining CPI, he was an associate editor at Education Week, and his work has been honored in the National Awards for Education Reporting by the Association of Black Journalists and the Society of Professional Journalists. Corey, thank you as always for making time for EWA Radio.
Thank you, Emily. It's always a great time, and I hope to speak with you again soon.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story or a reporter you want to learn more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For nearly 75 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take good care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.